Our special guest today is Dr. Ryan Cragun. In order of importance, Ryan is a husband, a father, and an empirical sociologist, but I suspect he's a better husband and father because he's a sociologist, right? His scholarship focuses on non-religion and Mormonism. His research has been published in a variety of academic journals, including the Journal for Scientific Study of Religion, the journal Sociology of Religion, the journal Social Sciences and Medicine. He's an experienced author and editor. 3 of his books are on sale today, if they're not already gone. Today he's talking about the work done for his most recent co-authored book, Beyond Doubt, the Secularization of Society and Organized Secularism in the U.S. That was co-authored by Ryan with Isabella Casselstrand and Phil Zuckerman. When he's not working, he's spending his time with his wife and son, hiking or tinkering with computers. It's becoming harder though these days, isn't it? Yeah. Originally from Utah, he now lives in Florida and works at the University of Tampa. Ryan is a friend of the CFFC that we've been honored to have with us before in the past. Help me in welcoming back Dr. Ryan Cragun.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Thank you for that introduction. That was very nice. And awesome work. This is really exciting. So you'll notice up here, it's not the title of the book. I'm giving a slightly different presentation, but it is based on one of the chapters in the book. So that's where we're going to come back to it. But the book, it's a lot of fun. It's just to give a very quick summary of the book, Beyond Doubt. We're looking at secularization, which is the decline of religion around the world. So we look at over 100 different countries around the world using publicly available survey data. And what we show is if countries meet 2 criteria, so they're modernizing and they have freedom of or from religion, then we see secularization basically happening. And we document that in the book. There's a lot of kind of theoretical discussions. It is a bit of a wonky book. We're taking issue with some people who have written about this in the past. There is a chapter in there where we talk about whether religion is innate. We're going to come back to that. That's part of the presentation today. So that's really the focus. I was asked to put something together for Darwin Day for my local Freethought group. So this is actually where this is coming from. So I'd already prepared it, but it is based on that. But that's basically where we're going today. So I'm talking about 2 pieces, evolution of religion, natural exploits, and artificial selection. We're going to kind of talk about this in a couple of different ways. And I'm happy to take other questions about the book and other things at the end. Okay, so 2 ways to think about this relationship between religion and evolution. The first one is, have humans evolved to have religion? Like I said, this is the one that we talk about in the book at length, right? There's an entire chapter on this. Spoiler alert, the answer is no. But I'm going to go through this in depth, right? I'm going to talk about it at length and talk about why, first, that there are people who propose this, right? And second, why I would say that is absolutely not the case, okay? The second way to think about this relationship is to ask, have religions themselves evolved? Okay, which is, I always think is kind of an ironic question since so many reject the idea of evolution. But again, spoiler alert here, the answer is yes. So religions do evolve, and I've talked about this in a number of my books, including one of the others that's up there today. But that's what we're going to kind of tackle today in the presentation, is those 2 big questions in detail. Okay, so I want to start with this first one, which is, are humans innately religious? Okay, we do have some tendencies that people kind of draw in and say, oh, well, maybe this is what's contributing to it, okay? The typical argument is that some human behaviors seem more natural than other human behaviors, okay? For example, humans seem to naturally anthropomorphize things. And I don't know if you've done this, right? I'm guilty of this myself. So I put a picture up here. That is, in fact, my car, right? I do drive a Tesla. How many of you have named your cars? Why do we name cars? Right? Isn't it, you love the car, right? We love our cars, right? But are cars animate objects? Do they need names, right? And we don't just do this with cars. We do this with computers. How many of you had an imaginary friend at one point in your life, or had a kid who had an imaginary friend? So we do have this proclivity to anthropomorphize. That's absolutely true. Okay? Now, that's not true for everybody, but most of us have this proclivity to anthropomorphize. We name our vehicles. That's fine. We do this, right? Do you talk to inanimate objects? Has anybody ever yelled at your computer? Come on, who's yelled at your computer, right? Is your It's awkward now because I used to say, is your computer listening? And now it's like, it might be, right? Like it's getting crazy with AI. But when we're talking to them, like we kind of know they're not listening, but we do it anyway. So this suggests something about human psychology and how we have evolved, right? We've evolved to anthropomorphize. That's perfectly fine. I'm not challenging that at all. I think that's absolutely true. The implications is where I begin to disagree with some people. Okay, so I want to just kind of mention that we do have this proclivity to anthropomorphize. That's fine. Here's another one. So there's another typical argument, right? Some human behaviors seem more natural than others. This one is also kind of interesting. We have an ability to mentalize. Okay, what does that mean to mentalize? We can kind of recognize that other people have a brain. There's stuff going on inside that brain, and we can kind of figure out what's going on inside their head. Some of you have probably seen this meme before. I like it, right? It's a fun one. What's going on inside his head, right? What's going on? What is he thinking? Come on, and I know it's awkward. Like, come on, what is he thinking?
Nice ass.
Nice ass. Somebody's gonna say it, right? It's like nice ass, right? And why it's such a great meme is we don't know what he's actually thinking, but we all kind of know what he's thinking. What's she thinking, right? She's pissed. She's furious. And the best part about that is, again, we're not hearing them say anything. We're mentalizing that they are individuals with thoughts. They have brains, and as a result, we can kind of imply, like we can infer there's something going on there. This is a natural ability. Why might we have evolved this ability, right? We are fundamentally social animals. We're going to come back to this issue, and the fact that we're social animals is what makes us so successful, okay? But the only way that we can be social is if we can mentalize. We have to be able to interact with other people. So we're going to come back to that, right? But we can certainly ask those questions. What are they thinking? We got this. All right. How are those two ideas related to religion? I think this is an interesting question. So we bring this back. Are humans innately religious? Well, mentalizing and anthropomorphizing are often connected to religion because of this next part, right? We read intention in random acts and then create the gods that we think are causing those acts, okay? Today, I think we have a pretty good sense of what causes a tsunami. Did they even a few hundred years ago? So when that tsunami, that wave of water hits, what are they thinking? Who's doing this, right? That would be Poseidon. That's Poseidon, right? So, or lightning. Do we have a pretty good sense of what causes lightning today? Yeah. I mean, we can even predict it, right? We're pretty good at this. Come on, what's he doing? This is his, oh, sorry, I hit the wrong button. That's his weapon of choice, right? Zeus, throwing lightning bolts. When you don't know what causes lightning, but if it happens to do something that you want, right? So maybe, like, let's imagine, I like this scenario, right? Let's go back several thousand years. Humans don't really understand what causes lightning, and let's say that you're in a small tribal group and you've got a love interest, okay? So there's somebody you really, really like, but they like somebody else. And then one night there's a storm, right? And lightning hits a tree, knocks a tree branch down, and kills their love interest. Now I know that's awful, that's terrible to think, but was it intentional? Right? Are we reading intentionality in effectively random acts? Do we do this? How many of you have seen images in those clouds? Come on, we've seen shapes in clouds. We're really good at pattern detection when there is nothing there. This is what we do, okay? And there are lots of reasons for why we might do this, but it's the mentalizing and anthropomorphizing, these kind of natural proclivities that we have that have led us to eventually create gods. Now, it's pretty clear the direction that I'm arguing this, right? So I'm clearly saying like, oh, sure, we create the gods. But there are other scholars out there, and this is part of the reason why we have an entire chapter about this in the book. There are other scholars out there who flip the directionality around, okay? Who says this? Well, I've got a couple kind of, I don't know, we'll just go with these individuals, right? Because they're fun. They are mentioned in the book, but they're also big names, right? So my first one, this is Christian Smith. He is an endowed chair at the University of Notre Dame, one of the biggest names in the sociology of religion. So that's him up there, right? He's the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. Here's what he has to say about non-religion, not religion, non-religion, right? Consider the work of, this is a quote from the book, consider the work of sociologist of religion Christian Smith, who describes religion as being irrepressibly natural to being human. According to Smith, humans are so primordially and innately religious that secular humanism cuts against the very grain of nature's reality structure. In fact, religion is such a genuine natural human tendency that, according to Smith, to live secularly is analogous to crab walking backwards. That is a direct quote. Sure, it can be done, but it's clearly awkward and unfeasible, if not downright futile. Smith goes even further and compares people living secularly to individuals who might choose to, direct quote, repeatedly hit themselves in the head with sharp objects. This is an endowed professor at Notre Dame saying what about our human nature? Can we naturally be non-religious? No, that's like hitting yourself in the head repeatedly with sharp objects. He's not the only one, okay? If it was just one crank out there, it'd be easy to dismiss. But this is kind of the dominant perspective in the social sciences still today. So there's a reason why we're arguing this in this book, is we're saying, hey, come on. Like, really? This is where we are? Three more that I want to quote, right? So here's another one. This one's actually, he's a psychologist. He actually just recently retired. But his name's Robert McCauley, wrote an entire book on this very topic, okay? Another quote from our book. According to Robert McCauley, religious expression in beliefs and practices is nearly inevitable in most people. Y'all feel this? Just like an innate urge to be religious right now, right? It's pretty fascinating, but that's what he's saying. He's a psychologist, just retired. Another one, Justin Barrett, president of Blueprint 1543, but he's held positions at Oxford, a variety of different places, very well-known scholar. Here's what he has to say on this. Justin Barrett characterizes a lack of supernatural religious faith, specifically in God, and note capital G God, right? I'm very intentional about that, as constituting not merely a state of unnaturalness, but as a true oddity. A secular naturalistic worldview is, according to Barrett, so abnormal that it is only found among the privileged and the elite. Did you all know you are the privileged and the elite, and they are the only ones who can have this, right? According to Justin Barrett. Then we get one more kind of side note on this next one. So the book came out not quite a year ago in May, so Beyond Doubt came out in May. At a lot of the conferences that I go to, these academic conferences, we'll set up what's called like an authors meets critics panel. So we'll have critics come and talk about the book, and then we get to respond. We actually invited Christian Smith. He turned us down, right? Which is great, because we were like, yeah, we quoted you saying really shitty stuff, and he didn't show up. We quoted this next guy too. Larry Iannacone, who is another huge name. He's an economist, but he writes mostly on religion. He's also an endowed chair, right, at Chapman University. He was also supposed to be on the panel. He bowed out at the last second, right? So we could not get any of the real critics to actually show up and kind of tell us why we're wrong, which is kind of unfortunate. I was looking forward to kind of going down with Larry Iannacone. And actually, I'm a pretty friendly guy. Like I talk loud here, but in person, I'm kind of friendly. I have two co-authors on the book, Isabella Castlestrand, who's actually even kind of sweeter and kinder than I am. Phil Zuckerman would punch the guy in the face, right? Which, like, Phil is pugnacious. Like, he will go at it. So I was actually really looking forward to that, because Phil was there and he was ready to throw down with Larry. Here's what Larry had to say about the non-religious. Larry Iannacone goes even further, insisting that without a bedrock core religious faith undergirding all our morality, customs, and institutions, people would cease being recognizably human. Does this make sense, right? So when I say we put a chapter in here, it's not because we're like arguing against a straw man. We're arguing against endowed chairs in the social sciences who all believe that religion is innate. This is part of who we are, and we cannot be non-religious. That's why we made this, that's why we put this together, right? So we built this up in there. Okay, so how do we counter this? What are some of our arguments? I don't go through all of these in the book. We have some other arguments in the book, but I've kind of put together a presentation that I think is pretty straightforward. So, are humans innately religious? No, right? The answer is no, but that's not according to them. People with PhDs are saying that they are, right? Still no. Sorry, they're not. They're just wrong. And now we're going to talk about why. And I think it's actually pretty straightforward. I think it makes sense. Audiences like this are probably going to be pretty familiar with fallacies. but there are 3 very prominent logical fallacies in their arguments, and we're going to unpack each of those. And then, of course, we actually have tons of evidence to back this up, too. So yes, we're doing a little philosophy here. It's just like logical arguments, but we will eventually get to the empirical evidence. So like I mentioned, you're probably familiar with logical fallacies. I think there are 3 that underlie most of the arguments that they're making. Non sequitur, the false dichotomy, and then the last one is cum hoc ergo propter hoc, which is another fun one. It's Latin for with this, therefore because of this. We'll talk about each of those, and I'm going to unpack them in turn. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. That's the direction that we're headed. All right, so part of the title of this presentation was natural exploits. What are we getting at with natural exploits here? Okay, so I'm actually going to just start out and say, like, okay, this is fair. Humans evolve traits that facilitate sociality. That's fair, and we're going to talk about why that is, and it makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, those traits have given us proclivities to anthropomorphize and mentalize. Up to this point, I think we're actually all kind of in agreement. Right? I don't think there are any real issues. I think most of us would be like, yep, okay, that's fair. It's the next step that becomes a bit problematic, and that's where we're headed. Okay, I want to come back to this issue particularly of mentalizing, right? And why it's actually so important for humans. I've got a picture up here just to kind of illustrate it. I like doing things with pictures. But if we were to take any one of you, right? Clear this room out. So it's just a hypothetical. We empty the room of everything except the walls. We strip you naked. Sorry, it's a weird image, right? But we strip you naked and we put you in here with a lion. Who's going to win? Lion's going to win. I'm sorry. And there's probably one person who's like, I don't know. I'm pretty tough and I can fast. Like I can get around. Are we the strongest animal out there? The fastest, the biggest teeth, the biggest claws? Then why are we, and it's awkward to say because I don't mean it in like a hierarchical sense, but why are we the dominant or apex predator on the planet today? Okay, so a lot of people are pointing to brains. I would say it's not even just our brains. Because how many of you can build a gun? Okay, so it is our brains, but it's our collective brains. It's the fact that we are social that makes it that we have the technology to actually lock them up in cages and do all these awful things that we do to the animals, right? But it's our ability to mentalize, to communicate with other people, which ultimately gives us culture, and it's the culture that makes us dominant over these other species. Now, there's a lot of that too. I'm not going to disagree with that, right? So it's ultimately our ability to work with others that allows us to succeed. So those mentalizing and anthropomorphizing abilities are actually a core part of who we are. We evolved this way so we can coordinate our activities, right? Can you imagine just trying to go one-on-one with a woolly mammoth? You're probably not going to succeed, but if you can get a whole bunch of people to say, drive it that way, we'll all stab it here, like that coordination is what makes us so successful. Our shared collective goal-oriented activity that is all done through mentalizing and anthropomorphizing, all of that comes out of this. So hopefully that makes sense. That's why we do this. This is why we've evolved this way to do this. So coming back to this argument, right? So the natural exploits. We talked about this. We're all good at this point, okay? Here we get to where things start to go a little bit off the rails, right? Now we have institutions arose that exploited these proclivities. That's my framing of this. That's, again, not Christian Smith and Larry Iannacone and the others. That's how I would see religions. Religions didn't start over here off the screen. They arose after these came into existence. We're going to talk more about that, but what does that ultimately make religions? Aren't they effectively opportunistic parasites? I mean, is that wrong, right? Is my logic flawed here? Is that a non sequitur? Like, call me out, right? This is a logical argument. But at the end of the day, they arose to take advantage of our human proclivities, not the other way around. We didn't evolve to be religious. Religions are taking advantage of who we are. And this is where Christian Smith and Larry Iannacone, they all get it wrong. They flip the causal ordering around. They're like, oh, we evolved because this is what God wants, right? Convenient how that works. Okay, so coming back to this question, right? Ultimately, that is a non sequitur, what they're arguing. Why must religion exist to exploit those human proclivities or traits? Doesn't have to, right? The logic of the humans are innately religious argument is this. Humans evolve specific traits. those traits make us innately religious, which is an individual level argument, and we're already rejecting that, but let's pretend that we actually accept that, right? Therefore, religion should or must or has to exist. Do you see the problem? Like, as soon as you put it out as just like a really simple syllogism, it falls apart. The argument makes no sense logically. But they don't seem to catch this, okay? So that's the first flaw there. There are actually two fallacies in this, and I'm going to unpack both of them. But you can see that it just doesn't make a lot of sense once you unpack it. All right, so to illustrate this, the problem with these fallacies, again, I like doing things diagrammatically and pictures, so I just want to kind of lay this out here. Humans evolve specific traits. We're fine with that, right? Those traits make us innately religious. That's where the problem is. Let's put this on a timeline, okay? We split off from our closest primate relatives roughly 4 to 6 million years ago. Everybody good here, right? We're on track, okay. Organized religions develop like 8 to 4,000 BCE. So maybe 10,000 years ago is when we get the beginnings of organized religion. We don't know the actual date that Hinduism comes into existence, but that's roughly our best guess, right? So it's kind of lost. But that's the oldest of the big remaining kind of extant organized religions. When do we develop our ability to anthropomorphize and mentalize? Okay, and interestingly, other primates actually have some of this ability too. So it's not like we're the only ones who have this, but it's clearly before organized religions, right? So if we're just thinking about this in terms of causal ordering, there are 3 really basic rules, we're going to come back to this, to determining causality. 3 really basic rules. I go over these with my students all the time, right? A must precede B in time. Well, if religions come into existence here, but the mentalizing and anthropomorphizing come into existence at least here, is there any way that we could have evolved to be religious? Right? They've reversed the causal relationship here. It just makes no sense. It's just illogical, the argument that they're making. So my preferred logic, and this is really out there, right? Just go with me, is this right here. That's it. Humans evolved with specific traits. I'm not making any more arguments beyond that. That's it. We just evolved with specific traits. Where those lead is an open question. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with that. Now, there are other pieces to this that we're going to kind of continue with. I like playing with this a little bit because I think it's kind of fun. But let's just pretend that if we did this with other traits that we've evolved with, right? So let's just kind of go with this for a second. Humans evolved to have less hair than our primate relatives. That's true. Does that mean that we're all innately nudists? But this is the argument that they're making, right? They're like, oh, okay. And this is QR code to Scientific American where it talks about why we evolved to have less hair, right? We did. We evolved to have less hair. Let's try another one. Humans evolved to be able to chase our prey long distances, which is actually tied to the hair, right? Is that true? We evolved to chase our prey very long distances. This is why we're really successful. Does this mean that we're all innately marathon runners? Okay? No, it doesn't, right? But that's the logical ordering that we've got here. Last one. Humans evolved to use language. We all can innately speak. We can't. We have to learn language, just like we have to learn religion, right? As I just mentioned this to somebody else the other day. In that first book that I published over there, I have this fun phrase as a chapter titled, All Babies Are Atheists, right? Because it's true. They are, right? You have to be taught to believe in a god or gods or anything like that. So again, just kind of illustrating the logical fallacies in this. All right, so moving on, our non sequitur. So that's the first one, the logic of humans are innately religious argument. Doesn't really make sense, and we can unpack. So assuming like this is clearly not true, but the next one doesn't follow either. So if the first one is true, right, humans evolve specific traits, neither of the second two have to follow. It's a non sequitur. The basis of their argument, which they've written entire books about, just doesn't follow. Doesn't make any sense, okay? All right, our next one. So I want to unpack one more, and then we're going to kind of do some other stuff here, and then we'll turn to our last argument. But non sequitur 2, right? So here's the argument. Religions must exist. Not true. Humans have traits that make us innately religious. Those traits are individual level traits, okay? Why would individual level traits lead to institutional level developments? Just because we have something at the individual level doesn't mean we must create institutions that correspond to those, right? So religions are institutions. They're not individual. They're institutions. They don't have to exist. They're social constructs. Again, if we did this with other aspects of our lives, we'd find really interesting things, right? Humans are innately social. We just established this. Does that mean that fraternities and sororities must exist? No, right? Like, again, as soon as you point it out, it makes a lot of sense, right? Let's try one more. Humans are innately hierarchical. Does this mean we must have nobility? Who's like, oh, we must have a King Charles because we're innately hierarchical, right? Or my last one, this is one sport that I do follow, right? Humans are innately competitive. Must we therefore have soccer? Right? Like, no, right? And I get it. Some of you may, like Messi, right? He's now in Miami. That's great. But again, as soon as you start pointing this out in other aspects of the social world, it makes it pretty clear the arguments that they're making just don't make any sense. Okay, real quick, I want to do just like a thought experiment with you, right? What if that first human who thought, humans are gullible. If I create a system of belief that convinces them I speak with supernatural forces, I could get away with without having to hunt, gather, or farm, instead just never had that thought. Would we have religion? Do we have to have religion? Is there anything about our society that is like, oh, no, we are biologically like we must have this or our society will collapse? No. It makes no sense, okay? And I know I'm spending a lot of time just destroying this argument. I think most of you agreed with me to begin with. I just want you to have the evidence like, oh, actually this doesn't make any sense, right? So in what way would humans as a species be appreciably different if religion as an institution never existed? And again, I'm kind of mostly thinking at a biological level. If we just took religion out of the equation, would our society collapse? Nope, would be fine, right? And we're going to talk more about this because we have empirical evidence to back that up later. Okay, so a couple more just to kind of wrap this up. But we would basically have those traits, just no one would be exploiting them the same way. There's another kind of piece to this. There are two more logical fallacies that I want to get at, and then we're going to move to the other piece. I mentioned a false dichotomy, okay? These authors seem to think that really you only have two choices. There's either religion or there's not religion, okay? Turns out that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? There are possibly some other things that could take advantage and exploit those proclivities, right? Things like acupuncture, superstition, clairvoyance. Do these actually exist? Are they organized religion? No. So it's a lack of imagination on their part that they're thinking, oh, well, humans mentalize, humans anthropomorphize, therefore there must be religion. I'm like, it's just a lack of imagination. It's a false dichotomy. You don't have to have just religion or not religion. There are lots of other things, and I'm not advocating for this. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that these are okay. I'm just saying there are other things that can exploit our natural proclivities. All right, the last one, right, gets to our kind of Latin phrase here, cum hoc ergo propter hoc. With this, therefore, because of this. I've got a fun sign here which makes me laugh every time I see it. But again, they're basically reversing the causality in this argument. Just because many humans are or were religious doesn't mean we must be religious, right? I don't know if any of you have seen this sign before, but it cracks me up. Dinosaurs didn't read, now they're extinct, right? Isn't the logic exactly the same? It's literally the same logic, right? It makes no sense. So they're basically saying, well, religions exist, so they must exist. No, they don't. Like, there's just no reason that has to work, okay? All right, so that was a lot of kind of logical arguments. That's fine, I get it. As David mentioned, I identify as an empirical sociologist. I like numbers. This is not a numbers-heavy presentation. I do like numbers. So I'm going to give you a little bit of kind of numbers just to back this up. Wouldn't it be nice if there were kind of like some easily interpretable data that showed definitively that humans are not innately religious? Okay? Sure, be pretty easy, right? And this would be nice. So let's try this one, right? What if there was a kid who grew up without religion and then didn't invent one? Wouldn't that actually be sufficient evidence to prove these guys wrong? Well, turns out I have one, right? That's my son, right there, okay? So this is us having a snowball fight. He's 14 now. He was raised without religion. He's come to a number of the Freethought groups, right? David actually asked about him when we got here. He identifies variously, depending on who he's trying to piss off, as an atheist, a Satanist, a humanist, like all of those things, right? We've had a number of these conversations. Has he invented a religion? Does he feel a need for religion? Nope. Right? I get that's a sample of one, right? It's anecdotal. We don't really like that. But let's try a little bit more, right? So there's one. I just got some really basic evidence for you there, right? We're going to skip over this. What if there was an entire society where there were lots of people who were not religious, and they didn't all repeatedly hit themselves in the head with sharp rocks, or walk around crab walking backwards, or collapse into crime and lawlessness and anarchy and debauchery? If there was a society like that, wouldn't it kind of like illustrate that these guys are full of shit? Have you ever heard of Estonia? Right? Turns out the vast majority of Estonians today are not religious. So I have a colleague over there, right? His name's Atko Remmel. He's awesome, right? Atko's a great guy. He's a good scholar. He's done a bunch of research on this. He consistently tries to ask Estonians the same questions that we ask Americans about religion. And Estonians are like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So if you ask them like, oh, do you believe in God? And they're like, I don't know what that is. They don't even say no. They're just like, I don't know what that is. Isn't that fascinating? They're so far out of religion that it just doesn't even it doesn't make sense to them. Do you believe in heaven? What is that? Right? They don't say yes or no. They can't answer the questions. Is Estonia a bastion of lawlessness? A bunch of people running around hitting themselves with sharp rocks, right? No. It's actually a well-developed, highly developed country. Everybody's fine. Things are normal. Do we have evidence? Sure. There you go, right? And they're not the only country. There are plenty of other countries. In the book, we talk about majority non-religious countries. Scotland is now majority non-religious. Most people don't realize this. England is majority non-religious. Japan, majority non-religious. South Korea, majority non-religious. Okay? Denmark's a little tricky, but they're on their way, right? So most of the Scandinavian countries are tricky, and we could talk about that later. But most of them, if you ask about beliefs, 100%, affiliation's the tricky part, right? What does this illustrate? Can there be societies that have no religion and function perfectly fine? Do we need religion? No. Okay. Did humans evolve to be religious? Every time I hear this claim, I can't believe that people actually think it, right? They're just like shitty sociologists. That's what it is. It's really as easy as those two things. My son's name's Torin and Estonia. You could literally just mention that, like, I know a kid who's not religious and he didn't invent one. Done. Your argument is stupid, right? But then you can go beyond that and show them all the logical fallacies. You can point to Estonia and all these other countries and say, look, it's pretty clear. They're not inventing a religion. They're past it. Religion is a relic, right? It's an opportunistic parasite that took advantage of some of our characteristics. We do not need this. The logic is tortured, the evidence is ignored, and the conclusions were all determined a priori. They're wrong, okay? Did I hit it? Is everybody good with that, right? So you don't need to read that chapter in the book now. Good, we're good. The second point, right? So this was a Darwin Day thing. I think it's kind of fun. But the second point that I wanted to bring up is this one. Have religions evolved? Okay. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Fairly well-known sociologist. His name's Émile Durkheim. He's kind of one of the founders of the discipline. He's a French sociologist writing in the 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st century. He actually made a really interesting argument in his book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. He said, religions are actually interesting because they sacralize society. They take the hierarchy of a society and they turn that into the religion. So what we actually see with this, which is pretty interesting in what Durkheim was arguing, right, is that in tribal societies, you actually have polytheistic gods. Because in tribal societies, right, most of the people are actually equal. You might have like one person who's kind of in charge, but there's a lot of equality. Turns out their religions, this is the Japanese pantheon, their religion seems to reflect the hierarchy of the society. Isn't that interesting, right? So it's a really interesting insight that he had over 100 years ago. He's like, wow, religions seem to take the social structure of the society, sacralize that, and turn that into the religion, right? Try the Roman Empire, okay? What do? Do they have a chief god? This picture's back, right? Yeah. So their pantheon seems to look a lot like the the hierarchy of the society. They've basically sacralized the values and the beliefs of the society. They've turned the religion into a reification of the existing hierarchical structure. Do we eventually get to just one person having all the power and a religion that reflects that? So when we get to kings who are effectively all powerful, don't we also have monotheistic religions that reflect that? It's pretty insightful, Durkheim, right? It's interesting. But what I think is actually even more interesting now is that we don't like these hierarchies anymore, right? So what's happening with religion? Well, a lot of it's dying, right? So we talk about that at length in the book. But for those who want to remain religious, what is happening? They're turning to Wicca or paganism, which are non-hierarchical religions. So we're going back to this period where it's like, why should I listen to this priest? What makes him an expert over me? So we're seeing this interesting reversal in religiosity, that where we see any religious growth these days in modernized, developed countries that have freedom of religion is actually a transition back to more egalitarian religious structures where people can say, you know what, I'm just as much of an authority on what works for me as any priest or clergy. Does that make sense? All right. The last point that I like to mention, I've talked about this in a number of my books. I think it's actually a really important thing. If you don't take anything else away from the discussion today, you need to remember this word, right? Syncretism, it's a great word. Some of you have probably heard it. My students have never heard it, and it blows their mind when I mention it. But basically, no religions exist in a vacuum, okay? Religions always exist next to other cultures. And as a result, religions adopt pieces from other cultures. And we all kind of know this, right? At heart, we kind of know this, but it kind of just takes somebody mentioning it for it to like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? My favorite example of this, Easter, right? So when I mention this to my students, they're kind of like lose their minds. The word Easter comes from the Germanic deity, right? So she was a goddess, Eostre. That's where the term actually comes from, okay? Here's the fun part. She was a fertility deity, and guess what her symbols were? Rabbits and eggs, okay? So this is why my students, when I mention this to them, they're like, wait, what? Those are celebrations of a Germanic pagan deity? And I'm like, yeah, find them in the Bible for me. Show me where in the Bible it says, we're going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus with rabbits and eggs. And they're like, that's not in there? I'm like, yeah, you haven't read the Bible, have you, right? It's not in there. There's nothing about rabbits and eggs in the Bible. How did those get into our culture, and where did Easter come from? Right? They have no idea. Well, as the Romans, who had converted to Christianity, moved north to attack the barbarians, right, the barbaric Germans, guess what they did? As they move in, they start adopting different aspects of the existing society. They incorporate them into the religion. It makes it easier for them to become Christian. Syncretism. They syncretize the beliefs of the existing populations. Now here's how nefarious this is. We actually have clergy in the Vatican writing to other clergy in England as the Romans are kind of moving into England saying, hey, all of their local deities, just turn them into saints. They literally wrote it down. They said it. They're just like, just turn them into saints. They'll adopt it. We're good. Right? We know they did it. It was intentional. It's fascinating when you think about it. Okay? We have plenty of examples of this. All of them. So I've got others in here. Certainly we've done this with Christmas as well, right? So a lot of Christmas stuff. It's all syncretism. My favorite example of this is actually what, again, the Catholics did as they came and conquered the Americas, right? So there were obviously lots of people here. They had well-developed religious structures. They had temples all over the place. As the conquistadors come in with the priests, what do they start doing? Oh, that's a sacred spot, right? On top of that hill? Great. We're just going to tear down the old church, right? And we're going to build a new one right on top of it. And the deity that it represented, that's a saint. They just incorporated it straight into the religion. Okay, so Catholicism definitely did this, right? And this is part of the reason why saint worship's actually even bigger in Latin America. I'm not going to read all of this stuff, it's a lot, right? But I want to show you an actual picture because this one's great. This is the Precious Blood of Christ Catholic Church in Teotitlan del Valle, Mexico. Okay, what you can't see from the distance is that they literally have the stones from the previous temple that they built right into the existing church. So they tore down the indigenous religious temple and used the exact same materials to build a Catholic church. They didn't even hide it, right? They're just like, oh, this is a sacred spot for you guys. Got it. We're just going to tear down your church. We're going to put up a Catholic one. Now you're all Catholic. And there's a saint who kind of works out here, right? It's pretty straightforward. Now, the part that I think is really interesting with this, and that often gets left out in a lot of these discussions, particularly when we're talking about evolution, right? When we think about evolution, we tend to focus on natural selection, okay? We're all familiar with this, natural selection. So there are pressures that lead people to evolve or different things to evolve in different ways. We're all on board with that. But if there is natural selection, doesn't there also therefore have to be artificial selection? Do we ever talk about the artificial selection side of evolution? We kind of ignore that piece, right? Which is interesting. So if we're ignoring it, what is actually covered by the artificial selection side? Let's just unpack this for a second, right? When we think about natural selection, here's a good example for everybody here, right? So these are our sea cows. They are actually quite closely related to cows, right? But that would be natural selection. So there are natural pressures that lead them to evolve in different ways. What about those? Somebody tell me that that is natural selection, because I am going to call bullshit on that. There is nothing natural about those poodles. And you may love your poodle, that's fine, but is that thing going to survive for even 5 seconds in the wild? That thing's done, right? How did we get poodles? That's artificial selection, right? Does that make sense? It's artificial selection. Okay. Have we done this with other aspects of our society? So certainly crops, right? So we've domesticated plants and animals. Absolutely, that's artificial selection. We've certainly done it with dogs. But we tend to think about this as just kind of natural things. What about government? Okay, so we may have had tribal chieftains, but now we have presidents. Is that natural selection or artificial selection? That's artificial selection. We don't think about it that way, right? Because we're so fixated on this idea of evolution only applying to biology, doesn't it also apply to culture? That's the nurture side of the nature versus nurture. This is artificial selection. We have selected various forms of government over time. Those are artificial pressures. There's nothing natural about it. It's artificial. Haven't we also done this with religion? So we have our kind of magic workers, right? Our shaman. How do we get from that to this? That's not natural selection. That's artificial selection. Does that make sense? So do religions evolve? They syncretize 100%, and we artificially select them over time. It's our pressure, humanity's pressure, that's putting pressure on them. Okay? I'm going to mention one other thing real quick, and I'm going to wrap up. There is another scholar out there. He's actually a psychologist, Aaron Norenzayan, who wrote an entire book called Big Gods. And the argument that he was making in this book, I think I have it up here, right? He wrote a book called Big Gods. The argument he's making is that it was the invention, so he is kind of admitting that big gods are invented, but the invention of big gods, monotheistic deity, is what makes big societies possible. Okay? Let me just kind of draw the linkage for you. This is the argument that he makes. He says, how can you trust somebody else in a really big society? In small societies where you have like a couple hundred people, you know everybody, there's a lot of social policing because you kind of know everybody, that's fine. But once you get to a really big society where there are tens of thousands of people, you don't know everybody, how do you know if you can trust them? The argument that Aaron Norenzayan makes is, well, if everybody thinks there's a God watching them, then you can believe that they're going to be honest. And I know a lot of you are like, bullshit, I know a lot of religious people and they are not honest, right? And I get that. So I read his book very skeptically, and he's trying to make all these arguments, and I was like, I'm not buying it, Era. Like, I'm not a huge fan. But that's his argument. He's saying monotheistic deities are monitoring people's behavior. As a result, we can trust each other, and this is how we get big societies. Big gods lead to big societies. I read the book. I was like, okay, I'm kind of interested in this. And then I was like, he left something out, and I wonder how intentional it was. I haven't talked to him since, right? But I'd need to ask him something. He never once mentions one really important thing in here, right? So this is all about like trusting people. If somebody screws you over, well, the gods are going to get them, right? I was like, there are also these guys. Don't we have big guards? So if somebody breaks the law, do we have to just be like, oh, well, God will get them, right? It's just God. The gods will take care of this. Or like, hey, guards, go stab that dude, right? Like, done. Problem solved. He never once mentions government, police, guards, military. He just conveniently leaves that out of the argument. I was like, well, that's interesting because we have ways to police people's behavior that does not involve supernatural entities. Okay? All right, I'm going to wrap up here. Did we evolve to be religious? I think y'all know the answer at this point. It's pretty solid no. Do we have proclivities? Yes, we do. Do they make us religious? No, they do not, right? Do religions evolve? Absolutely. 100% in lots of different ways. Lots more that I could say. I'm going to wrap it up there. Book is up here, right? Talks about lots of other things. It's a very data-heavy book, lots of theory. I think I've got a QR code if you want to kind of search for it.
Thanks so much, Ryan. We appreciate you being here.